Hey guys, welcome to this 8th episode of Logic Pro Crash Course, talking about compression. I want to quickly define it and talk about basic and advanced ways of using it. So what is it? In a nutshell, it is automatic volume control. So it helps louder stuff to kind of be tamed a little bit. So if we have a drum track, we can increase the volume, bring up the subtle stuff, and use a compressor to bring down the louder stuff. So the quieter stuff we're able to pull up a little bit, and the loud stuff doesn't get too loud in this track. So let's take a look at a common interface here. So this is where we would establish our threshold, meaning we want things above a certain loudness level to be controlled. And if you're unsure, you'll see at the top here all these different compressor types, VCAs, FETs, digital, opto. If you're unsure which type to use for your drum set, if you're vocal, start with a preset. Go ahead and go here, drums, maybe, how about rock kit? All right, so there we go. And since your recorded audio might be a different recorded loudness relative to what they use to kind of dial in these knobs, you're going to have to set the threshold by ear or by eye. Typically a compressor, in a lot of cases, it's just you barely want it touching. Not all the time, but often you just want a little bit of compression here. So let's go and hit play. So that's reducing it by about 5 decibels, and it's art. It's not science. So maybe you prefer it to have a lower threshold and to be hitting it a little harder, maybe with a lower ratio. Maybe you prefer the sound of that. And maybe once you dial in on these two knobs, and you kind of like the general sonic character of it, maybe suddenly in the mix it's quieter than it first was, or maybe it's a little too loud, and that's where your makeup gain comes into play, where you can kind of put it back in the mix where it was before. Then you can kind of play and experiment with bypassing it. And boy, oh, here's my bypass. I turn on and off. You can hear what it's doing pretty well that way. Knee and attack and release. The short answer is I'd probably leave these all wherever the preset dictated. I don't think I'm going to go into knee. But I will address attack and release. This is saying once the sound gets loud enough to cross the threshold, how quickly do you want this compressor to kick in? So if you had an instant attack of a drum, some of that nice hit of the snare drum might start to sound weird. Some engineers want to let that initial attack be heard more naturally, and then to have the compressor kick in. And the release means once the sound drops below the threshold, how quickly do you want the compressor to return to not affecting the sound? Because even when the sound drops below the threshold, it's still going to be compressing a bit. So this kind of lets it kind of release the sound over time. In this case, 100 milliseconds, 1/10 of a second. Ratio means how much you want to reduce the sound. Once you establish a threshold, the sound crosses it. Do you want to squash it? That would be a high ratio. Just totally not allow it to get any higher. That would be a high ratio. If you just want to subtly tame that volume, it would be a lower ratio. Just tell it to chill out a little bit. That would be a low ratio. Okay, let's try again on the vocal track. I think I want to introduce a more advanced compression technique here, and at the same time review those concepts we just talked about. So let's get a compressor for this vocal. The concept I want to talk about is called serial compression, and this would be using 2 or 3 compressors kind of in a chain here. So the first compressor here, we would want a low threshold and we want a low ratio. Maybe we should go to our vocal presets as a starting spot. So maybe a medium vocal. So again, low threshold, maybe a low ratio, 1.5 or 2, 1.3, somewhere pretty low. I have to dial it in by ear. And now we encounter the fact that this plugin also has a built-in second compressor, one with a high threshold and a high ratio. So I'm going to deactivate this second compressor for the sake of simplicity. And now if I hit play, we can see that this compressor, every time she starts singing, it's kicking in pretty good. So maybe I might want to pull my threshold up just a little bit, get more of a natural feel to this. Something like that, perhaps. So then I would get a second compressor on this track and set more of a medium threshold and a medium ratio. So let's go again to voice. Let's call studio vocal for my medium one. So again, space bar, and I think we can speed up this a little bit with a swipe. Just select these two measures where I know she's singing, kind of have that loop over and over. So maybe lower my threshold a little bit. Lower my ratio. Is this one backwards? Sometimes these are backwards. So the reason why this is backwards is some compressors, think of it as they have an established threshold. It's a ceiling, and this is like a volume knob. So the more sound you turn up, it's going to hit that ceiling sooner. So sometimes it's set up that way, and sometimes it's the other way, meaning just backwards, like the more compression on the other side. So sometimes it's one way, sometimes it's the other in terms of this first threshold knob. And this one, it's saying the more you turn it up, the sooner you're going to hit that threshold established ceiling. And then again, I would choose my ratio, my makeup gain. So that's probably a little bit too much. Oh boy. Is this one backwards? I may have misspoke. This one, it's not backwards. It's kind of like the others, where it's a regular threshold and I pull it down this way. All right, so a medium ratio might be about a 4, somewhere in that ballpark, 4 to 5. Oh, I guess this would be a 4. So maybe somewhere about in there. And then for the final one with a high ratio and a high threshold, you could opt to use this built-in limiter on this if you want, or to get a final plug-in here, either either compressor or something like the adaptive limiter, where again you establish the ceiling, or establish this one has a fixed ceiling, like I was saying before, so it's set, and the more gain you pull up, the more sound hits that ceiling, and the more sound gets told to turn down. So if I turn this down, in theory, we should see this doing less. So a limiter is a compressor with a high ratio and a pretty high threshold, just kind of protecting the loudest stuff keep it from clipping. All right, so a couple more advanced techniques. Another one is parallel compression. So let's take this compressor, and so these have the ability to have a built-in parallel. So to do that, I would turn this on, and then it would just be this mix knob. I would kind of mess with these knobs. I would turn down this threshold, and I would slowly mix in these two. So in theory, this has a built-in parallel compression ability. But let's engineer it with a separate compressor. So the way that would work would be, I would have this drum track. It might be easier to see in the mix view. So I'll do Command 2. This drum track, I would use a bus. Let's use a new bus. So this lets the sound fork out to a bus. Let's use bus 2. We'll see a new track appear right here. I'll label it PC for parallel compression. And I'm going to option click on this knob. That turns it up. I'm going to make this pre-fader, which means the sound forks out independent of this fader. So if this were being adjusted up and down, it's not going to mess with the sound that's hitting this parallel compressor. That's the way I prefer to engineer this. Then I would choose my compressor. I would want something pretty aggressive for these drums. So maybe in this case we'll choose slammed kick. Let's see what that's going to do. Spacebar. Alright, so it's a pretty high threshold. It's smacking it, you can see. And I can adjust the makeup gain and the threshold to my liking. And once it's squashing it pretty good, the general idea is you would take that natural sound of the drums. Where'd my plugin go? Oh, my mix screen, I meant. Here's the natural sound of the drums, and you would take that parallel compression and slowly fade it in. And yes, it's going to make it sound louder, but also it makes it sound more full. So this is one of those things that if you've ever wondered why do your mixes not sound like stuff you hear on the radio? The proper use of compression in general and techniques like serial compression and parallel compression with a little practice and experimentation can go a long way toward improving your tracks and making them sound more like the stuff coming out of the professional studios. Alright, so this, again, you got to dial it in by ear. So that's parallel compression. The sound forks out with a bus, gets over compressed, and then you just blend in that over compressed sound with the natural sound. Okay. We'll talk about ducking briefly. So let's say we have a vocal track like this one, Bailey, and when she starts singing, it's sometimes hard to hear her because the acoustic guitar is a little loud, and it's kind of in the same frequency range as our vocal. So, but we like the level of the acoustic guitar. It sounds good. It sounds nice and full with the drums and the bass. So sometimes this technique can be used to fix that. So what we want is a compressor on this guitar track. Compressor. And instead of the compressor reacting to itself, I mean the sound source of this acoustic guitar, we can tell this to look to the vocal track, and every time the vocal track is active, to compress the acoustic guitar, to get the acoustic guitar a little quieter every time she sings. So you'll see I'll hit spacebar, and every time she sings we see compression being applied to the acoustic guitar. Now my guess is this is probably too much. This is going to be too obvious, or we want to be a lot more subtle, maybe about 3 decibels with this one. So let's see if we can get there. And somewhere around 2 or 3, that might be helpful. That might be enough. So every time she sings, these duck down a little bit. In fact, this engineering technique is called a ducker. Get that acoustic guitar to duck under the vocal every time the vocal starts to sing. Okay, the last thing I think I want to point out is there's such a thing as a multi-band compressor. So if we have something with full spectrum frequency audio, so low frequency sounds like a kick drum, mid-range stuff like toms and snare drums, and high frequencies like cymbals, to apply one compressor to all of that sometimes isn't the best tool, because if the kick drum is activating the compressor, the compressor is going to compress everything, including cymbals, and it can sound really odd. So here's what it would look like. Let's go ahead and do it on the drum track as we're talking about. So let's go to Dynamics. Multipressor is our multiband compression. And this allows us, to establish frequency zones. So if I discover the kick drum is kind of down in this area, then I can establish a threshold for that kick drum. And the ratio, maybe I want a more aggressive ratio. And then I have a makeup gain. And in this zone, maybe that's paying attention to the toms and stuff like that. And I can adjust the threshold down until sound starts crossing it a little bit. I can do the same. Maybe I can dial in the snare a little bit more specifically for this drum set, and pull down the threshold until it starts doing something. Maybe I want this to be a little more aggressive. Makeup gain if I want. And cymbals, in general, compression and cymbals don't get along very well, in my opinion. They sound really odd really quickly. So I might just leave this alone, to be honest. But if you wanted to compress that sound, I'd be very careful about it. Just the smallest little bit, or not at all. So that's multiband compression, used on things like drums, sometimes on the master fader. So once your mix is all together and you want to do something in the direction of mastering, the multiband compressor, where is it, multipressor? The multiband compression would be something more along mastering. So again, you could choose a preset as a starting spot, final pop compressor maybe, and again dial in the specifics. Maybe you have to change some of these boundaries for your song, but it's a pretty interesting tool and sometimes can be very helpful. All right, so I think that's all I want to talk about. So those are the techniques, and I think if you practice using them, I think your mixes will take a big step up if you can kind of wrap your brain around this and practice using Logic as a musical instrument and get these. I think this stuff will really help if you practice it and use it. Just be very conservative with some of these things, or if you're going to be aggressive with your compression, try doing it in little bits like we talked about with that serial compression. And I think this will help your mixes a lot. All right, I look forward to hearing your comments, and feel free to contact me with any questions. I'll see you guys. Bye-bye.